For 30 years, I lived beside my wife in Augusta, Georgia, and I never once saw her fully undressed, not in daylight, not in lamplight, not even by accident. It wasn't a joke between us. It was a rule carved into our marriage like stone: lights off, bathroom door locked, bed sheets pulled high, her body always hidden like it was something dangerous. I told myself it was modesty. I told myself it was her boundary. I told myself love meant not asking for more. But the morning I heard her body hit the tile, hard, final, followed by a silence that didn't sound human, I broke that door down with my own hands. And what I saw on that bathroom floor didn't just explain the darkness, it rewrote my entire life. Before we begin, I need to ask you something. If you've ever loved someone who kept a secret so deep it shaped your whole home, please subscribe and stay with me. And if you've lived through something similar, tell me in the comments. I read them when the house gets quiet, and it helps more than you'd think. In Augusta, Georgia, there are certain streets that don't change no matter how many years pass. The same brick ranch houses with screened porches. The same pecan trees leaning over driveways like old men eavesdropping. The same church signs with letters that always look like they're about to fall off. Our house sat in a quiet neighborhood off Walton Way, not far from where I worked most of my life. It wasn't grand, but it was steady, like us. A place with worn hardwood floors, a backyard that always needed mowing, and a kitchen table that held more of our family history than any photo album ever could. We raised 3 kids in that house. All grown now, scattered across Georgia and South Carolina with lives of their own. We have 4 grandkids, loud, bright, full of motion, always leaving behind fingerprints on glass doors and crumbs in couch cushions. And still, after 30 years of marriage, there was one thing that never changed. I never saw my wife undressed. It wasn't something I told friends. It wasn't something you bring up at cookouts or church potlucks. It sat inside me like a private oddity, a quiet confusion I carried the way some men carry an old injury, something you learn to walk around. Even in the early years, she kept herself covered like it was a moral law. When we went to bed, the lights were already off before she stepped into the room. She would slip under the covers fully clothed, then move carefully beneath the sheet until she was ready to sleep. Not once did she sit on the edge of the bed in a towel. Not once did she wander into the hallway looking for a robe. Not once did she call out to me from the bathroom asking for a clean shirt. The bathroom door was always locked. Not mostly locked. Locked every time, without exception. And when she slept like a person guarding something. The sheet pulled high, arms tucked in close, her body sealed away from the world. Even in the Georgia heat, even in August when the air conditioning struggled and the ceiling fan turned slow like it was tired. There were moments, small, accidental moments, where I might have caught a glimpse of something. But she never gave the world that chance. If I walked down the hallway and reached for the bathroom door without thinking, she reacted like I was breaking into a bank vault. Her voice would sharpen, her breathing would change, and I'd hear the panic in the way she moved, quick and defensive, like an animal startled in a trap. After the first few years, I stopped reaching for that knob at all. I learned the map of my own house around her privacy. If my toothbrush was in there, it could wait. If I forgot my watch on the sink, I would go without it. If I needed a towel, I used a different one. If I ran out of deodorant, I bought more instead of stepping across that line. That's how you adapt when you love someone who has invisible fences around them. You don't call it control. You don't call it fear. You call it respect. And for a long time, that word, respect, felt noble enough to carry the weight of it. But respect doesn't stop curiosity. It doesn't stop the quiet ache of being kept out. Because the truth is, no matter how many years pass, a marriage is still a shared life. Shared mornings. Shared nights. Shared bodies growing older together. Shared vulnerability. And I lived with a woman who would rather sleep fully covered than let her husband see the shape of her skin. Over the years, I tried to explain it away the way a man explains away anything he doesn't want to face. I told myself she was modest. I told myself she was old-fashioned. I told myself her upbringing was strict. I told myself I should be grateful she loved me in the ways she could. And she did love me, quietly, faithfully, in the practical language of meals and folded laundry and remembering my doctor appointments before I did. But there was always that locked door. That darkness. That sense that she was living beside me, not fully with me. The hardest part wasn't the lack of sight. It was the feeling that she didn't trust me with the truth of her. Not completely. Not in the way two people are supposed to after decades of building a family together. I can still remember the first time I noticed it, really noticed it, back when we were young enough to believe love could solve anything. It was long before the children. Long before the mortgage. Long before gray hair and aching joints. Back when we were just two people circling each other carefully, not knowing what we were stepping into. I met her at a church social. It was one of those community nights where the fellowship hall smelled like coffee and pound cake, and the older ladies lined up folding chairs like they were preparing for something sacred. Somebody had brought a little speaker system, and a man in a pressed shirt was playing music that made the room feel softer than it was. There was a kind of dancing. Not wild, not young. Just couples swaying in slow circles under fluorescent lights that never did anyone any favors. She was there in the corner at first. Quiet. Long sleeves, even though it wasn't cold. A high collar. Hair pinned back like she didn't want attention from anyone. I remember thinking she looked like someone who had spent her whole life being careful. And I mistook that carefulness for virtue. When I finally worked up the nerve to approach her, she didn't lean away. She didn't smile too wide either. She just looked at me with those steady eyes and nodded like she was deciding whether I was safe. I didn't understand then that some people aren't choosing modesty. Some people are choosing survival. And I was about to build a life with a woman whose body had become a place she didn't want anyone to enter, not even the man who promised to love her. Not yet. Not ever. Back then, before the decade settled on our shoulders, I thought love was mostly about showing up. I believed if you kept your word, worked hard, stayed steady, you could build something that would hold. That belief was why I didn't question her too much in the beginning. Our courtship was simple. Old-fashioned in a way that already felt rare, even then. I'd drive over to her mother's house in the early evening, park along the curb, and walk up the front steps like I was stepping onto sacred ground. Her mother kept the porch light on every night, the kind of warm yellow bulb that made everything look softer than it really was. We'd sit out there in those straight-backed porch chairs, the air thick with summer humidity and the distant sound of sprinklers clicking on and off down the street. Sometimes her mother would sit inside near the window, not hovering exactly, but present enough that nothing improper could happen even if we'd wanted it to. But we didn't. We talked. We talked about church, about work, about the price of groceries, about the way Augusta seemed to move at its own pace compared to Atlanta. I told her stories about my job. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was careful, like each sentence had to be approved by something inside her before it could leave her mouth. I noticed early on that she dressed like the weather didn't apply to her. Long sleeves in spring. Long sleeves in summer. A cardigan even when the air was thick enough to drink. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It wasn't like she was trying to stand out. It was the opposite. She dressed like she wanted to disappear. And I, like a fool with good intentions, translated that into modesty. Into decency. Into the kind of quiet character church people like to praise. When we started going on walks, it was always in public places. A park near the river. A loop trail where older couples strolled and mothers pushed strollers. She liked paths that stayed open and visible. She didn't like the wooded parks. She didn't like places where the trees leaned in close and the shadows made the world feel private. The first time I reached for her hand, she flinched. Not a big flinch. Not something anyone else would have seen. Just a small tightening in her fingers, a pause in her breath, the tiniest hesitation before she allowed it. Then she held my hand back. And I told myself it was sweet. That she was shy. That she wasn't used to being touched. But over time, I began to see a pattern. She never wanted to go swimming. Never wanted to go to the lake with friends. Never wanted to take a weekend trip where we'd need to share a hotel room. Never wanted to stay out late enough that her mother might not be awake when she got home. Even the smallest situations that involved changing clothes, trying on something new at a store, borrowing a jacket, rolling up her sleeves to wash dishes, she avoided them like they carried risk. I remember one afternoon we walked through a little downtown shop that sold dresses and church clothes. The kind of place with mirrors on every wall and soft music playing overhead. The owner offered her the dressing room, smiling like she was doing her a favor. My wife, she wasn't my wife yet, but she already carried that guardedness. She stiffened. She smiled politely, shook her head, and said she'd come back another day. We left with nothing. When I asked her later if she'd found something wrong with the store, she told me she just didn't feel like trying things on. And I accepted it. Because that's what men like me do when we want to keep things peaceful. We accept. We smooth over. We tell ourselves it's not our business. We dated for months like that. Porch visits. Park walks. Sunday lunches after church. Holding hands, nothing more. The farthest we ever went was a quick kiss that felt like a question more than an answer. There was something almost innocent about it. But there was also something restrained. Like she was walking beside me with one foot always ready to step back. When I finally asked her to marry me, I did it the way I'd always imagined I would. Nothing fancy. No restaurant crowd. No big speech. Just the two of us, sitting on that same porch, the evening air buzzing with insects and the soft hum of her mother's television inside. I asked her quietly, and I meant it with everything in me. And the moment I asked, I watched something shift in her face. Not joy. Not relief. Fear. It moved across her eyes like a shadow passing over sunlight. Her hands tightened around the arms of the porch chair, knuckles pale. She didn't look at the ring right away. She didn't reach for it. She stared out at the yard as if she was seeing something that wasn't there. For a long time, she didn't answer. And in that silence, I should have understood. I should have leaned in with patience and asked her what she was afraid of. I should have made room for honesty. But I didn't. I was younger then. Proud in the wrong ways. Eager to believe the best. Eager to believe love was simple if you were a good man. Eventually, she nodded. Not excited. Not glowing. Just a slow nod like she was agreeing to something heavy. We got engaged, and everyone around us celebrated like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her mother cried. The church ladies hugged her. My friend slapped me on the back and told me I'd found a good one. And she smiled through it all, polite and contained. But in the weeks that followed, I noticed her anxiety sharpen. She became quieter. More distracted. Like her mind was always running ahead to something she couldn't bear to face. And when the wedding date got closer, I saw it in her body. The way she kept distance even when we sat together. The way she didn't linger when I kissed her cheek. The way she pulled her sleeves down even when they rode up an inch. She was bracing for marriage the way some people brace for surgery. And I, still convinced I was doing everything right, told myself it was normal nerves. That she'd relax once we were husband and wife. That time would fix whatever was tight inside her. I didn't know then that time doesn't heal what stays hidden. It only buries it deeper. We were married on a Saturday afternoon in a small church not far from where we'd met. Nothing extravagant. White flowers, wooden pews polished thin by decades of hands, sunlight slanting through stained glass and landing in soft colors across the aisle. She wore long sleeves, even in her wedding dress. Lace covered her arms all the way to the wrist. At the time, I thought it was elegant. Modest. Fitting. I didn't want to notice, that she never changed in front of anyone that day. Not the bridesmaids. Not her mother. Not even me. When it came time to leave for our honeymoon, she changed in a locked bathroom at the church while I waited in the car, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. It struck me as unusual, but weddings are unusual days. I told myself that was all it was. Savannah was only a few hours away. We stayed at a small inn near the historic district, brick paths, moss hanging low from oak trees, the air smelling faintly of salt and old stone. It felt romantic in that quiet southern way, like the city was holding its breath for us. But from the moment we stepped into the room, something tightened. She went straight to the lamps and turned them off one by one until the room was dim enough that shapes blurred at the edges. Then she went to the bathroom and locked the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sound of running water, the hum of the fan. I remember feeling nervous, but also hopeful. This was marriage. This was the beginning of the rest of our lives. When she came out, she wore a high-necked nightgown, thick fabric, long sleeves. She stood near the bed but didn't sit down right away. She reached back and turned off the last light. Total darkness. I couldn't see her face. She told me, quietly, carefully, that she needed things to stay dark. Completely dark. That intimacy could only happen that way. That it was important to her. I asked if she was all right. She said yes. I asked if she was afraid. She said no. I asked if I had done something wrong. She said no again, quicker this time. So I agreed. That was the beginning of the rule. Not spoken aloud as a rule, not written anywhere, but solid as law. Lights off. Always. No exceptions. No silhouettes. No reflections in mirrors. No moonlight through curtains. I never saw her body that night. Or the next. Or the night after that. I learned to navigate her in darkness, learned where she was by breath, by movement, by the subtle shift of weight on the mattress. I learned how to be careful with my hands, how to wait for her to guide what happened and what didn't. And when we returned to Augusta, the darkness followed us home like luggage we never unpacked. The bathroom door was locked every time she bathed. I never heard her sing in the shower. Never heard her relax. If I knocked by accident, she reacted with a sharp panic that cut through the house like broken glass. Once, early on, I reached for the door because I'd forgotten my razor inside. The sound she made, half gasp, half cry, stopped me cold. I apologized through the door like I'd done something terrible. She unlocked it only after she was fully dressed. From that point on, I learned. I learned to keep my things elsewhere. I learned to announce myself in my own house. I learned to give her space even when it confused me. When we went to bed, the routine never changed. Lights off first. Then her. Then me. Always in that order. Sometimes I lay awake afterward, staring into the dark, listening to the ceiling fan click softly overhead, wondering what it would be like to see the woman I married. Wondering what she looked like when she wasn't braced or guarded. But I didn't ask. I told myself love meant patience. Years went by that way. And then she got pregnant. That, too, happened in darkness. She told me she was pregnant one morning at the kitchen table, her hands folded around a mug that had gone cold. There was no ceremony to it. No tears. No laughter. Just a quiet statement, like she was reporting the weather. I remember feeling two things at once, joy, and a strange apprehension I couldn't quite name. Pregnancy brought changes to our house, but not the ones I expected. Her body changed, of course. I knew that logically. I saw it in the way her clothes fit differently, in the careful way she moved, in the way she rested a hand on her stomach when she thought no one was watching. But I never saw her change. She dressed alone. Always. She undressed alone. Always. Even as her belly grew, even as buttons strained and hems rode up, she never let me see her skin. Not once. She bought looser clothes, longer shirts, thicker fabrics. At home, she layered herself like the world was cold even when it wasn't. She went to her medical appointments alone. That surprised me more than anything. I offered to go. I wanted to hear the heartbeat. I wanted to sit in those plastic chairs and pretend I wasn't nervous. I wanted to be part of it. She smiled gently and told me it wasn't necessary. That she preferred to handle it herself. That she didn't want to make a fuss. So I stayed home. I learned about my own children secondhand, from pamphlets left on the counter, from brief summaries she gave while washing dishes, from dates written on the calendar in careful handwriting. When our first child was born, I waited in the hallway while nurses moved around with practiced efficiency. When they finally brought the baby to me, I felt that familiar swell of love and fear, the sense that my life had just shifted its center forever. She kept herself covered even then. Visitors came and went. Family crowded into the room with balloons and flowers. She smiled and accepted congratulations, but she never loosened her grip on the blanket pulled high against her chest. When the nurses helped her, she asked them to close curtains and doors. She watched them closely, like she was counting every movement. Breastfeeding happened behind closed doors. Diaper changes happened with her body turned away. Bath time for the baby happened with the bathroom door closed. Nighttime feedings happened in the dimmest light possible. I became a father in a house full of doors. As the years passed and we added more children, the pattern deepened. It didn't soften with familiarity or trust. It hardened. She never walked around the house in a robe. Never answered the door without being fully dressed. Never let the kids see her changing, not even when they were toddlers too young to understand what they were seeing. She taught them early that certain rooms were private. That certain doors stayed shut. That knocking was required. That privacy was serious. The children learned quickly. Our house ran smoothly on rules no one questioned out loud. I learned to cook more meals. Learned to do laundry. Learned to help in ways that didn't cross her lines. If she needed help bathing the kids, she asked me to handle the parts that didn't involve her being exposed. If she needed rest, she rested fully dressed, blankets pulled high, like sleep itself was something to be guarded. From the outside, we probably looked like a normal family. Church on Sundays. Dinner together most nights. Kids' schedules pinned to the fridge. Photographs on the mantle. But inside, there was a constant choreography built around what could not be seen. I don't think the children noticed at first. Children accept the world they're given. They assume it's how things are supposed to be. It wasn't until they were older, teenagers, asking questions, noticing differences, that I began to see flickers of confusion in their eyes. Why mom never swam with them? Why she never tried on clothes in front of anyone? Why she was always dressed, even late at night? Why dad always knocked? I answered the way I always had. Your mother values her privacy. That sentence did a lot of work for me over the years. It protected her. It protected the marriage. It protected me from asking questions I wasn't ready to hear the answers to. Decades passed like that. The children grew up and moved out. The house grew quieter. The rules stayed. I adapted so completely that it almost stopped feeling strange. The darkness became routine. The locked doors became background noise. I told myself every marriage had its peculiarities. That ours were just more defined. But there were nights, lying awake beside her, listening to the familiar rhythm of her breathing, when I felt an absence I couldn't name. Not loneliness exactly. Something closer to exclusion. Like there was a room in her life I'd never been allowed to enter, no matter how many years I held the key to everything else. I didn't know then that the door would one day open by force. And that when it did, I wouldn't recognize the woman I thought I'd known for 30 years. Aging doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in quietly, the way moisture creeps into old wood. You don't notice it until something starts to warp. At first, it was little things. She misplaced her keys more often. Stood at the stove too long, forgetting why she'd turned the burner on in the first place. Asked me the same question twice in one afternoon, then laughed it off like it was nothing. I laughed with her. We were in our late 60s by then. Forgetfulness felt earned. A side effect of years lived fully. But it didn't stop. She began losing words mid-sentence, her mouth shaping sounds that never quite arrived. She'd call one of the grandchildren by the wrong name and then go very still, like she'd stepped onto thin ice. I started paying closer attention. The house, which had once run like a system of well-oiled habits, began to slip out of sync. She left cabinet doors open. Forgot laundry in the washer. Put things in places they didn't belong, remote controls in the pantry, mail in the refrigerator. Still, the rules remained. Bathroom door locked. Lights off. Privacy enforced with the same intensity as always. When I suggested a doctor's visit, she resisted at first. Said it was nothing. Said she was just tired. Said everyone forgets things. Eventually, after a near miss with the stove that filled the kitchen with smoke, she agreed. The diagnosis came softly, delivered in careful language and sympathetic looks. Early-stage Alzheimer's. The word sat between us like an object neither of us wanted to touch. From that day on, the shape of my role changed. I became the one who watched more closely. The one who reminded her of appointments. The one who checked behind her after she finished a task, just to be sure everything was safe. Caregiving crept in the same way the illness had, quietly, gradually, until one day I realized I was planning my hours around her needs without ever having named it. The bathroom became the most difficult place. She struggled with the mechanics of the shower. Forgot how the knobs worked. Stood under running water too long, confused about whether she'd already washed. Sometimes she'd come out dripping wet, towel clutched tight, her face pale with embarrassment and anger. But the door stayed locked. Always locked. I offered help gently. Suggested sitting nearby. Asked if she'd let me hand her a towel or help with the water temperature. Each time, she refused with a fierceness that startled me. She would rather struggle. Rather risk falling. Rather hurt herself. Than be seen. The children started visiting more often once they understood the diagnosis. They noticed things I had grown used to. The way she repeated stories. The way she hesitated before familiar tasks. The way she hovered near the bathroom like it was both refuge and threat. They pulled me aside in quiet corners of the house. They told me I needed to supervise her bathing. That it wasn't safe anymore. That love sometimes meant stepping in even when someone resisted. I listened. But every time I looked at her standing there, fully dressed, arms crossed, eyes sharp with fear, I felt the weight of 30 years pressing down on me. Those rules weren't habits. They were survival mechanisms. So I tried to negotiate. I suggested leaving the door unlocked. Suggested cracking it open. Suggested I stand outside, close enough to hear her if she needed help. She rejected every compromise. Her words were clear, even as her memory frayed around the edges. She would not be seen. Not now. Not ever. And I let it go on longer than I should have. Because when you've spent decades respecting a boundary, it feels like betrayal to cross it, even when crossing it might save someone's life. The morning it happened started like any other. Breakfast at the kitchen table. Toast crumbs on her plate. Coffee cooling between us. Sunlight coming in through the window like it had 1,000 times before. She finished eating, stood up, and walked toward the bathroom. I heard the lock click. The shower turned on. And then, without warning, there was a sound I will never forget. A hard, final thud. Tile against bone. Then nothing. No movement. No voice. No water shutting off. Just silence. I stood up so fast my chair tipped over behind me. I called her name once. Twice. No answer. I moved down the hallway, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might tear loose. I put my hand on the bathroom door and rattled it. Locked. I called her name again. Nothing. In that moment, 30 years of rules collapsed into a single truth. If I didn't act, she might die on the other side of that door. I stepped back. Braced myself. And broke it open. The sound the door made when it gave way was sharp and wrong, wood splitting where it had held for decades. It felt like I was breaking into my own life. Steam poured out first, thick and wet, carrying the smell of soap and something metallic underneath. The shower was still running, water hitting tile in a steady rhythm that didn't belong in a moment like that. She was on the floor. Her body lay twisted in a way that told me she had fallen hard. One arm was bent beneath her, the other stretched out like she had tried to catch herself too late. The tile beneath her was slick with water, and for a split second my mind went blank, no thoughts, no prayers, just the need to move. And then I saw her skin. All of it. For the first time in 30 years, there was nothing between my eyes and her body. No darkness. No sheets. No fabric. No rules. Her back was turned partly toward me, and what I saw there stopped me so completely I nearly forgot to breathe. Her back was a map of damage. Thick, uneven scars spread across her shoulders and down her spine, warped and shiny in the light, pale in some places and dark in others. The skin looked pulled too tight in places, puckered in others, like it had been melted and forced to heal wrong. The pattern wasn't random. It was deliberate, directional, the kind of injury that comes from something poured, not something brushed. Boiling. My knees nearly gave out. Before I could speak, before I could reach her, she moved. Just a little. Enough to know she was conscious. Her first instinct wasn't to call my name. It wasn't to ask for help. It was to cover herself. She curled inward, arms crossing over her chest, trying to fold herself smaller, trying to hide even though I was already there. Her breathing turned sharp and fast, panic pouring out of her like the water still running from the shower head. I grabbed the nearest towel, my hands shaking so badly I dropped it once before managing to wrap it around her shoulders. I turned off the water, then knelt beside her, careful not to rush her, careful not to touch more than I had to. I spoke to her softly. Steadily. The same way I had spoken to her for 30 years when something upset her. I lifted her with more care than strength, carried her out of the bathroom, and laid her on the bed. I covered her completely, tucked the towel in like it was armor, then added a blanket on top. Only then did her breathing slow. Only then did she look at me. And in her eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. Not embarrassment. Not modesty. Terror. The kind that comes from a place so old it never learned language. I sat beside her and pressed ice gently against the swelling on her hip. She winced but didn't pull away. The room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner and the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I didn't ask if she was okay. I didn't ask why she locked the door. I didn't ask anything that would let her hide again. I told her, calmly, evenly, that I had seen her back. That the rules were gone now. That whatever she had been protecting, she didn't have to do it alone anymore. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she turned her head just enough to look at me. And she told me. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just facts, laid down like stones. When she was a child, her stepfather had punished her. Not with his hands. Not with words. With boiling water. She described a kitchen. A pot on a stove. The smell. The sound her own body made when it happened. She told me how she learned very young that pain could come without warning, that her body was not her own, that exposure meant danger. She spent weeks in the hospital. Months healing. Years hiding. She learned how people looked at scars. How questions followed skin. How curiosity could feel like another violation. So she covered herself. She learned that if no one saw, no one could hurt her again. By the time she met me, the rule was already written inside her. Darkness meant safety. Locked doors meant control. Being unseen meant survival. She had loved me, she said. Loved me deeply. But love had never been enough to make her feel safe in her own skin. When she finished, the room felt different, lighter and heavier at the same time. I sat there holding her hand, realizing that I had spent 30 years respecting a boundary without ever understanding the wound beneath it. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt humbled. Because the truth was simple and unbearable all at once. She hadn't been hiding from me. She had been hiding from the past. And now the past was out in the open, lying between us, no longer able to hurt her in silence. The house felt different after that morning. Not quieter. Not louder. Just honest. For the first time since I had known her, there was no rule hanging between us like a wire we had to step over every day. The door we'd lived around for decades was broken, and neither of us tried to repair it. Caregiving changed immediately. When she needed help bathing after that fall, she didn't lock the door. She didn't insist on darkness. She didn't apologize either. She simply stood there, small and tired, and let me help her like it was the most natural thing in the world. I kept my movements slow. Predictable. I told her what I was doing before I did it. Not because she asked, but because I understood now how much control had mattered to her. She still covered herself instinctively at first. Her hands moved before her mind could stop them. But the panic wasn't there anymore. The terror had loosened its grip. For the first time, she let me see her scars without flinching. They were worse up close. More extensive than I'd realized in that first moment. Some were old enough to have softened at the edges, others still angry-looking even after all those years. They told a story her mouth never could. I washed her hair. Helped her dress. Sat nearby while she rested. And each time, she grew a little calmer. The children noticed the change before I told them anything. They saw how I moved differently around her. How the bathroom door stayed unlocked. How the light stayed on. Eventually, I gathered them in the living room. I told them the truth. Not with drama. Not with anger. Just facts, spoken carefully, the same way she had spoken them to me. There were tears. Long silences. Hands over mouths. One of our daughters had to step outside because she couldn't breathe through it. Our son stared at the floor like he was trying to unsee a childhood he suddenly realized had been incomplete. But there was no blame. Only grief, for the pain their mother had carried alone, and for the years none of us had known. They showed her the kind of support that doesn't need words. Extra visits. Gentle voices. Holding her hand without squeezing too tight. Sitting with her when the memories tangled and the present slipped sideways. As the disease progressed, something unexpected happened. She became lighter. Not sharper, Alzheimer's kept taking its small, cruel bites, but emotionally lighter. Like a burden she'd been holding since childhood had finally been set down. She laughed more easily. She slept more peacefully. She stopped covering herself so tightly, even when she didn't remember why she ever had. Sometimes she'd look at me and say my name with a clarity that felt like a gift. Other times she'd call me by her stepfather's name and recoil in fear, and then calm when I reminded her who I was. I stayed. Every day. When the time came that she could no longer walk on her own, I carried her. When she forgot how to dress, I dressed her. When she forgot the rule entirely, I let it go. There was no more darkness between us. Only presence. She died quietly one morning with the sun coming through the window, our children nearby, my hand in hers. No fear. No covering. Just rest. I still live in that same house in Augusta. The bathroom door doesn't lock anymore. And sometimes, when the house is very quiet, I think about how love isn't always about being invited in. After she was gone, the house didn't collapse into silence the way people imagine it does. It settled. That's the only word that feels right. Settled like dust after something heavy has passed through. For a long time, I kept the same routines. Made coffee for two and poured one down the sink. Set out pills that no one needed anymore. Knocked on a bathroom door that was never locked. Habits don't die just because the reason for them does. The children worried about me at first. They called every day. Drove in on weekends. Tried to fill the space with noise and concern. I appreciated it, but I also knew something they didn't yet understand. I wasn't grieving a secret anymore. I was grieving a person, fully, honestly, without confusion clouding it. There was a strange peace in that. I thought often about the man I had been when I was younger. The man on that porch, mistaking caution for modesty. The husband in Savannah, agreeing to darkness because he believed patience was the same thing as understanding. I don't blame him. He did the best he could with what he knew. But I do wonder sometimes what would have happened if I had asked better questions. If I had made space for truth earlier instead of building my love around what I assumed. Not with pressure. Not with entitlement. Just with openness. Still, regret doesn't sharpen itself into anything useful at my age. It only dulls the days. So I let it go. I keep one photograph of her on the mantle now. Not a wedding photo. Not one from church. Just a simple picture taken years later in the backyard, sunlight on her face, sleeves rolled up slightly without her noticing, a moment of ease she never would have posed for. When I look at it, I don't think about what I never saw. I think about what she survived. I think about how strength doesn't always look like defiance. Sometimes it looks like endurance. Like building a life anyway. Like loving fully while guarding what still hurts. I think about the way she trusted me at the end, how the door stayed open not because she forgot to be afraid, but because she finally believed she didn't need to be. That kind of trust isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, after decades, and rests its weight in your hands like something sacred. If there's anything I know now, it's this. You can live beside someone for a lifetime and still not know the full shape of their pain. And loving them means being ready when the truth finally asks to be held. Time moves differently after everything important has already happened. The days still pass, the sun still rises over Augusta the same way it always has, but there's no urgency left in them. No rules to maintain. No doors to guard. Just long stretches of quiet where memory drifts in and out like a tide that no longer needs to obey a clock. I spend more time sitting than I used to. Not because I'm weak, but because sitting lets thoughts arrive on their own terms. I'll sit on the back porch in the early morning, coffee cooling in my hands, watching the light touch the yard she once kept so tidy. The bird bath still fills with water. The grass still grows uneven where the sprinkler never quite reached. Ordinary things, carrying weight simply because they remain. People sometimes ask me what 30 years of marriage taught me. They expect answers about compromise. Patience. Loyalty. Those things are true, but they're not the lesson that stays with me. What stays with me is this: silence can look like peace from the outside, and still be heavy enough to shape an entire life. For decades, I believed I was honoring her by not asking. By not pushing. By not insisting. I told myself restraint was kindness. That love meant accepting the shape of what was given and not reaching for more. And maybe, in some ways, that was true. But I've learned that silence is not always safety. Sometimes it's just survival dressed up as calm. If I could speak to the man I was at 40, steady, decent, proud of how patient he believed himself to be, I wouldn't scold him. I wouldn't tell him he failed. I'd tell him something quieter. I'd tell him that love doesn't weaken when you ask careful questions. That trust doesn't shatter just because truth is invited in. That some wounds don't heal on their own just because time keeps moving. I don't know if she would have told me earlier, even if I had asked. Trauma doesn't work on a schedule, and fear doesn't loosen just because someone deserves honesty. But I do know this, the relief she felt at the end, when there was nothing left to hide, was real. I saw it in her shoulders. In her breathing. In the way she slept without bracing herself against the world. That tells me something important. Carrying a secret for decades costs more than anyone realizes. I think about our children now, grown and busy, raising families of their own. They know the truth. They carry it gently, the way people do when they love someone and wish they'd known how to protect them sooner. They've asked me questions I don't always have answers for. Why didn't she tell us? Why didn't we see it? Why didn't anyone help her back then? I tell them the only honest thing I can. Because she learned early that survival meant silence. And because the world wasn't built to listen to children like her. I watch my grandchildren sometimes, how freely they move, how little they think about their bodies, how naturally they expect safety. And I feel a quiet gratitude mixed with something like grief. She would have liked to see that. A world where hiding wasn't the first instinct. At night, when the house is dark, but not the fearful kind of dark, I walk past the bathroom and leave the door open. The light spills into the hallway, steady and ordinary. It's a small thing. There's a certain age where the future stops demanding things from you. It doesn't disappear, exactly, it just quiets down. No more long ladders to climb. No more milestones waiting to be checked off. What's left is stewardship, of memory, of lessons learned too late, of love that no longer needs proving. That's the age I'm in now. People assume that after a loss like mine, the house would feel haunted. That every room would echo with absence. But that isn't how it feels. It feels inhabited, by truth, finally spoken, finally allowed to rest. I still sleep on the same side of the bed. Old habits die slowly. Sometimes I wake in the night and reach out, not expecting to find her, but because my hand remembers what it meant to reassure someone else's presence. When it meets empty air, there's a pause. Not pain. Just acknowledgement. I've learned that grief doesn't always announce itself as sorrow. Sometimes it comes as clarity. I see now how carefully she built her life. How much effort it took to be a good wife, a good mother, a good woman, while carrying something that would have crushed many people outright. She cooked, cleaned, loved, remembered birthdays, showed up to graduations, sat through church sermons, and raised 3 children while protecting a wound no one else knew existed. That kind of endurance deserves to be named. I think back to moments that make more sense now. The way she tensed at unexpected touch. The way she avoided mirrors. The way she dressed not to be seen, but to be safe. None of it was arbitrary. None of it was distance from me. It was distance from a memory that never let go. If there's anything I regret, it isn't the darkness. It's the assumption. The belief that silence always meant consent, that calm always meant comfort. I thought I was being respectful by not asking, but respect without curiosity can become another kind of wall. That's something I try to pass on now, carefully, without preaching. When one of my sons talks about his marriage, I listen for what he doesn't say as much as what he does. When my daughters talk about their children, I remind them gently that safety isn't just about locks and rules, it's about being believed, even when the story is hard to hear. I don't tell my wife's story to many people. It isn't mine to share freely. But when someone speaks about privacy the way I once did, like it's always a preference, always a choice, I feel a responsibility to slow the conversation down. Some boundaries are preferences. Others are scar tissue. You can't tell which is which unless you're willing to ask with patience, and wait without demand. In the evenings, I sometimes sit with the lights on longer than I used to. Not because I'm afraid of the dark, but because I no longer confuse darkness with respect. Light doesn't threaten me anymore. It just shows what's already there. And what's there now is quieter than before. But it's honest. Legacy is a strange thing. Most people think it's what you leave behind when you're gone: houses, money, photographs tucked into drawers. But living long enough teaches you that legacy is quieter than that. It's what keeps moving after you stop. It's what changes shape inside the people who knew you, without ever asking permission. My wife's legacy doesn't look the way she might have imagined it. There's no plaque. No formal acknowledgement. No neat story that can be told in a few sentences. What she left behind lives in smaller places, in pauses, in awareness, in the way our children pay attention now. After she died, something shifted in them. They became gentler in how they approached their own families. More deliberate. More willing to ask questions they once would have avoided for the sake of comfort. I saw it the first time my son told his daughter she didn't have to hug anyone she didn't want to, not relatives, not friends, not out of politeness. It was a small moment. Ordinary, even. But it mattered. My daughters changed too. They talk differently now when they check in on friends. They listen longer. They don't rush to fill silences. They understand that some truths take years before they're ready to be spoken, and that forcing them out too early can do more harm than good. None of this came from a lecture. It came from knowing. From understanding, too late but still in time, what their mother carried, and how well she carried it. The grandchildren know only pieces. Age-appropriate fragments, softened and simplified. They know their grandmother was very private. They know she had scars from long ago. They know she was brave in ways that didn't involve loud voices or big gestures. That's enough for now. One day, if they ask more, the answers will be waiting. Not hidden. Not denied. Just held with care. I sometimes imagine her watching them from somewhere I can't quite picture, watching them grow up with a freedom she never had, moving through the world without bracing for pain. I think she would feel something like relief. Not envy. Relief. As for me, I carry her story the way you carry something fragile and valuable, not displayed, not concealed, just protected. I don't speak of it often, but it informs everything. The way I listen. The way I don't assume. The way I understand that love doesn't always announce itself with openness. Sometimes love whispers. Sometimes it hides. And sometimes it waits decades for safety. When I look back now, I don't see a marriage defined by darkness. I see one defined by endurance. By two people who stayed, even when understanding lagged behind intention. She trusted me at the end in a way she couldn't at the beginning. And I carry that trust forward like a responsibility. Not to fix the past. But to be more awake in the present. Living alone in old age isn't as dramatic as people imagine. There are no sweeping moments of realization, no cinematic loneliness. It's mostly made up of ordinary hours, watering plants, sorting mail, listening to the radio low in the background so the house doesn't feel too empty. I still live in the same house. Friends suggested downsizing, moving closer to one of the children, finding something more manageable. I understood the logic, but I couldn't do it. This house holds a life that was fully lived, even if it wasn't fully seen for most of it. Every room has softened with time. The kitchen table where we raised our children now mostly holds newspapers and crossword puzzles. The hallway where I once learned to walk carefully now feels wide and forgiving. The bathroom, once the most guarded room in the house, is just a room now. Ordinary tile. Ordinary light. I age quietly here. Some mornings my hands ache when I grip the coffee mug. Some days I forget why I walked into a room and have to laugh at myself before worry has a chance to settle in. Aging humbles you if you let it. It reminds you that control was always an illusion. People ask me if I'm lonely. I tell them no, and I mean it. I miss her, of course. But loneliness suggests something unfinished, something unresolved. What we had found its completion, not in perfection, but in truth. There's a difference. I think back to our early years sometimes, not with regret, but with understanding. Two young people doing the best they could with what they had been given. I don't romanticize it. I don't wish it had been different. Wishing doesn't change what shaped us. What matters is that when the truth finally surfaced, it was met with steadiness, not rejection. That matters more than timing. I've come to believe that a good life isn't one without pain. It's one where pain doesn't get the final word. Where love stays when fear has had its say. Where dignity isn't loud, but consistent. She lived a good life. Not an easy one. Not a fair one. But a good one. She loved her children well. She showed up. She endured. And when she finally laid her burden down, she did so knowing she was safe. That's enough. For a long time, I thought marriage was about knowing everything about the other person. Now I understand it's about staying, especially when you don't. Staying long enough for the truth to feel safe. Staying long enough for someone else to rest. I sit on the porch in the evening sometimes, the same way we once did when we were young. The light fades slowly. The neighborhood settles. Life goes on around me. And I don't feel like something is missing. I feel like something was completed. There's a kind of advice people expect from men my age. They expect warnings. Regrets. Lists of mistakes to avoid. They want something neat they can carry away, something that sounds like wisdom because it's delivered slowly. But the truth is less polished than that. If a younger man sat across from me now, coffee between us, phone face down on the table, impatience still humming under his skin, I wouldn't tell him how to run a marriage. I wouldn't tell him how to be a husband. I'd tell him how to listen. I'd tell him that when someone sets a boundary, you should respect it, but you should also stay curious about why it exists. Not suspicious. Not entitled. Just open. I'd tell him that love doesn't mean you never ask hard questions. It means you ask them without demanding an answer on your timeline. I'd tell him that some people grow up learning that their bodies are dangerous places. That safety isn't assumed. That being seen can feel like an invitation for harm. And that no amount of devotion erases that lesson overnight. I'd tell him not to confuse silence with peace. Because silence can mean many things. Sometimes it means contentment. Other times it means fear has learned how to keep quiet. You can't tell the difference unless you're willing to sit with discomfort and not rush past it. Most of all, I'd tell him this. If someone you love is carrying something heavy, they won't always drop it just because you're strong enough to help. They'll drop it when they believe, deep in their bones, that you won't use it against them, won't flinch, won't leave. That kind of belief takes time. Sometimes a lifetime. I don't believe I failed my wife. And I don't believe I succeeded perfectly either. What I believe is that I stayed. I stayed when the rules didn't make sense. I stayed when I felt shut out. I stayed when understanding came late. I stayed when caregiving stripped everything down to what mattered. And in the end, staying was enough. There's a quiet justice in that, not the kind that punishes, but the kind that restores dignity. The kind that says a life marked by pain doesn't have to end in fear. That love can arrive late and still be real. When I turn out the lights at night now, I do it because I'm tired, not because darkness is required. The room stays visible. The world doesn't disappear. And when I close my eyes, I don't think about what I never saw. I think about what she finally let go of. That's the victory people don't clap for. But it's the one that mattered most. There is a moment most evenings when the house reaches a kind of stillness that feels earned. The television is off. The phone is face down. The last dish is drying in the rack. Outside, the neighborhood settles into itself, cars pulling into driveways, porch lights clicking on one by one, the soft chorus of insects beginning their work. That's when I usually stand in the hallway. I don't know why I pause there. Maybe because it used to be a crossroads, one door always closed, one space always guarded. Now it's just a hallway. Wood floor worn smooth. Walls that have heard decades of footsteps. I leave the bathroom light on. Not because I need it. Not because I'm afraid of the dark. Because it's allowed. That light spills out gently, nothing dramatic, just enough to remind me that some things no longer need protecting. That safety, once found, doesn't have to be hidden. People talk about closure like it's a door you shut. I don't think that's right. Closure, for me, has been more like setting something down carefully after carrying it for a long time. Not dropping it. Not erasing it. Just placing it where it belongs. My wife's life was not defined by what happened to her as a child, even though it shaped her. It was defined by what she built afterward. A marriage that lasted. Children who grew into decent adults. Grandchildren who moved through the world with a confidence she never had the luxury of learning young. She did not pass her fear on. That matters. When I think of her now, I don't picture the scars. I picture small, ordinary moments, the way she lined up the salt and pepper shakers just so, the way she folded towels into tight, precise rectangles, the way she listened more than she spoke. I picture her last days, lighter somehow, unburdened in a way I hadn't seen before. I picture her hand in mine, no tension in her grip, no need to pull away. That is how I choose to remember her. Not hidden. Not braced. At rest. If this story stays with you, I hope it does so quietly. Not as shock. Not as tragedy. But as a reminder that people are deeper than the rules they live by, and that patience, real patience, can sometimes arrive at truth without force. We don't always get to fix the past. But sometimes, if we stay, we get to soften the ending.